In the spring of 2014, a senior economist at Goldman Sachs wrote an internal memo that was quietly buried. It warned that India's GDP trajectory, if properly catalyzed, would make it the most disruptive force in the global economy within a generation. His superiors disagreed. The consensus at Davos that year was that India was too chaotic, too bureaucratic, too politically fractured to ever deliver on its structural promise. The memo was shelved. The economists moved on. And then India did exactly what the memo predicted, faster than anyone in those boardrooms was prepared to admit. Here is your data shock for today. In 2014, India's GDP stood at approximately $1.95 trillion, making it the 11th largest economy on the planet, trailing behind Canada, South Korea, Australia, and Russia. By the end of fiscal year 2024, India crossed the $3.7 trillion threshold, officially surpassing Japan to claim the fourth largest economy in the world. That is a near doubling of economic output in a single decade. That is not a trend. That is a structural transformation of historic proportions, and the Western financial press has systematically underreported every single stage of it. But here is what makes this story genuinely extraordinary. India did not rise because oil was discovered. It did not rise because of a one-time export boom or a currency manipulation scheme. India rose because of a convergence of forces so deep, so structural, and so self-reinforcing that the real question is no longer whether India becomes a superpower. The question is which legacy powers fail to adapt in time. Welcome to the Strategic Intelligence Report. I am your host, and today we are going inside the architecture of the most consequential economic ascent of the 21st century. Let us begin where all serious analysis must begin, not with the headline number, but with the conditions that made the headline possible. To understand why India's rise is a structural inevitability rather than a lucky streak, you have to understand what was happening in the global system simultaneously, because India did not rise in a vacuum. It rose precisely as the old pillars of the post-World War II economic order began to visibly crack. China's demographic dividend peaked and reversed. Europe entered what its own central bankers now privately call a prolonged era of institutional paralysis, unable to harmonize fiscal policy, energy security, or industrial strategy across 27 competing national interests. The United States began the painful political reckoning of a nation whose industrial base had been systematically hollowed out over 4 decades of financialization, and Russia, through its catastrophic strategic miscalculation in Ukraine, removed itself from the table of credible global economic partners almost overnight. Into that collapsing architecture, India stepped. Not stumbled, not cautiously tiptoed. Stepped. With a set of structural advantages that most Western analysts were too ideologically committed to their existing frameworks to properly evaluate. The first advantage is one that demographers have discussed for years but economists consistently undervalued: the sheer compounding force of India's working-age population. In 2024, India's median age was approximately 28 years. Germany's was 45, Japan's was 49, China's, critically, had already crossed 40 and was climbing. What this means in economic terms is not simply that India has more young people. It means India has a demographic engine that generates domestic consumption, labor supply, entrepreneurial risk-taking, and tax revenue simultaneously for the next 30 years. No stimulus package replicates this. No monetary policy intervention substitutes for it. This is macroeconomic gravity, and India has it in a way that no other major economy currently possesses. The second structural advantage is the one that the Goldman Sachs memo identified in 2014, but the investment community took a decade to price in properly: the digital infrastructure revolution. When Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government launched the JAM Trinity, the combination of Jan Dhan bank accounts, Aadhaar biometric identity, and mobile connectivity, the international commentary largely dismissed it as an ambitious development program for the rural poor. That framing was catastrophically wrong. What JAM actually represented was the construction of a financial operating system for 1.4 billion people. By 2023, India's Unified Payments Interface, the UPI system, was processing over 10 billion transactions per month. To put that in perspective, that volume exceeds the combined monthly transaction volume of Visa and MasterCard in the United States. A country that the IMF classified as a lower middle-income economy had built a payments infrastructure that was, by raw throughput metrics, more advanced than anything deployed in the G7. This isn't just a fintech story. This is the story of how India compressed what took the West 60 years of financial infrastructure development into less than a decade, and did it at a scale that no Western institution had the imagination to anticipate. If you value data-driven analysis over mainstream narratives, this is exactly the kind of intelligence that separates strategic thinkers from passive observers. Subscribe to this channel now and join a community that reads the global order before the headlines catch up. Now let us talk about the geopolitical catalysts, because no economy rises purely on internal dynamics. External shocks either accelerate or delay structural trajectories. In India's case, 3 external shocks between 2020 and 2023 functioned as accelerants of extraordinary force. The first was COVID-19. Yes, the pandemic devastated India's economy in the short term. GDP contracted by over 7% in fiscal year 2021. But the structural aftermath of the pandemic reshuffled global supply chains in ways that permanently benefited India's strategic positioning. The corporate boardrooms of Apple, Samsung, Foxconn, and dozens of Tier 1 global manufacturers had spent the previous decade concentrating their supply chains in China for cost efficiency. The pandemic exposed the catastrophic fragility of that concentration. When China locked down, global production locked down with it. The boardroom question that followed was not, how do we optimize? It was, where do we diversify? And the answer, almost invariably, pointed southeast. It pointed to India. The Indian government understood this moment with strategic clarity. The Production-Linked Incentive Scheme, or PLI, was rolled out across 14 sectors with a total outlay of approximately 1.97 trillion Indian rupees. The design was not a subsidy in the traditional sense. It was a performance-linked manufacturing incentive that rewarded companies for production volume achieved on Indian soil. Apple's iPhone manufacturing in India went from negligible to exceeding $14 billion in export value by fiscal year 2024. That single supply chain shift represents a structural realignment of global technology manufacturing, and it is, in every measurable sense, permanent. The second external shock was Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. The Western response, the coordinated sanctions regime, and the attempted isolation of Moscow created an unexpected and strategically consequential opportunity for New Delhi. India refused to join the Western sanctions coalition. It did not do this out of ideological sympathy for Moscow. It did this because of something that India's foreign policy establishment calls strategic autonomy, the doctrine of maintaining independent relationships across competing power blocks to maximize national leverage. India began purchasing discounted Russian crude oil at volumes that Western analysts found alarming. But here is what those analysts missed. The fiscal savings from discounted energy imports were not consumed. They were recycled into infrastructure investment and foreign currency reserve management. India's forex reserves during this period remained among the most stable of any major emerging market. The geopolitical neutrality that Western commentators criticized was, from a macroeconomic standpoint, a masterclass in national interest optimization. The third external shock was the structural deceleration of China. By 2023, the signals were no longer subtle. China's property sector, which had represented an estimated 25 to 30% of its GDP, including related industries, entered a crisis of confidence so deep that Evergrande's collapse was merely the most visible symptom of a systemic deleveraging. Youth unemployment in China crossed 20% before the government quietly stopped publishing the data. Foreign direct investment into China fell to a 30-year low. And the geopolitical friction between Beijing and Washington, regardless of any single administration's posture, had institutionalized a structural decoupling that no trade negotiation was likely to fully reverse. Into this vacuum of confidence, India moved. Not aggressively, not rhetorically, but with the quiet, structural permanence of a tectonic shift. Global investors who had spent 2 decades learning to say China as a reflexive answer to the question of where to allocate emerging market capital began, for the first time, genuinely learning to say India. To understand why this is a turning point rather than a cyclical moment, we have to look at the data they missed in the institutional forecasts of a decade ago. The World Bank's 2014 projections for India's 2024 GDP were, on average, approximately 30% below the actual outcome. The IMF's current Article IV consultations, the internal assessments that rarely make headlines, now routinely use language like sustained structural momentum and robust growth fundamentals when characterizing India's macro trajectory. These are not the careful, hedged compliments of development bank diplomacy. These are the quantitative signals that precede a global leadership pivot in capital allocation. Let us now examine the second-order effects, because this is where the analysis gets truly consequential. India's rise is not just a story about India getting richer. It is a story about what India's rise does to the architecture of global systems that were not designed with India's primacy in mind. Consider the technology sector. For 2 decades, the global technology supply chain operated on a simple model. The United States designed, China manufactured, and the rest of the world consumed. India participated primarily as a services exporter, providing software talent through an outsourcing industry centered in Bangalore, Hyderabad, and Pune. That model was intellectually limiting, and it caused many serious analysts to undervalue India's technological trajectory. Because what was actually happening inside those outsourcing companies was not merely cost arbitrage. It was the construction of the deepest pool of engineering talent outside the United States, a talent pool that is now being retained domestically at unprecedented rates, as Indian technology companies, Indian unicorns, and Indian government digital infrastructure projects offer compensation and complexity that no longer requires the mandatory brain drain to Silicon Valley. India produced 107 unicorn companies by 2024. The startup ecosystem in Bengaluru is now consistently ranked among the top 5 most active venture capital destinations globally. But more strategically significant than the startup numbers is what India is building for its own national infrastructure. The India Stack, the integrated architecture of digital public goods including UPI, DigiLocker, ONDC, the Open Network for Digital Commerce, and the Account Aggregator Framework, is not just a domestic innovation. It is a global export proposition. India is actively offering this technological architecture to developing nations across Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. When a country adopts India's payments infrastructure, it does not simply gain a transaction system. It enters a sphere of technological and, consequently, geopolitical alignment with New Delhi. This is how 21st century influence is actually built, not through military bases, through operating systems. The second-order effect in manufacturing deserves equal attention. India's transition from a services-dominated economy to one with a serious manufacturing base is the structural story of the next decade. The China Plus One strategy that global corporations began adopting post-pandemic is not a temporary hedge. It is a permanent reconfiguration of production geography. Samsung now produces a significant portion of its mobile devices in India. Foxconn has committed to multi-billion-dollar manufacturing facilities in Tamil Nadu and Telangana. Apple's supply chain diversification into India is not a pilot program. It is a long-term strategic commitment backed by capital expenditure decisions that take a minimum of a decade to reverse. But here is the second-order effect that most analysis misses entirely. When global manufacturing moves to India, it does not just create factory jobs. It creates the institutional ecosystem that supports manufacturing. Logistics companies, tool and die suppliers, quality management firms, industrial real estate developers, port infrastructure operators, and the entire professional services layer that a mature manufacturing economy requires. India is building this ecosystem at speed. The National Logistics Policy launched in 2022 set a target of reducing India's logistics cost from approximately 13 to 14% of GDP to single digits, bringing it closer to the 8% benchmark of developed economies. Every percentage point reduction in logistics cost represents, in an economy of India's scale, tens of billions of dollars of annual competitiveness gain. Now, I want to address the counterarguments directly, because intellectual honesty demands it, and because dismissing legitimate structural challenges would undermine the credibility of this entire analysis. India's rise is real and it is structural, but it is not without friction points of significant consequence. The first is infrastructure deficit. Despite the Modi government's remarkable acceleration of highway construction, metro rail expansion, and airport development, the gap between India's existing infrastructure stock and the infrastructure required to support a $10 trillion economy remains enormous. The National Infrastructure Pipeline, with its target of $1.4 trillion in infrastructure investment over 5 years, is ambitious. But ambition and execution are different categories of analysis. Delays in land acquisition, regulatory complexity at the state level, and the fiscal constraints of a government managing a significant debt-to-GDP ratio all represent genuine headwinds. The second friction point is employment quality. India's headline GDP growth numbers are impressive, but the composition of employment growth has not fully kept pace with the aspirations of its young workforce. The agricultural sector still employs approximately 45% of India's workforce, while contributing only 15 to 18% of GDP. The transition from agricultural employment to formal sector employment, the structural transformation that China executed between 1990 and 2010, is India's most critical economic challenge. Executing this transition while managing social cohesion, providing adequate education infrastructure, and maintaining the political stability required for long-term investment is the central test of Indian governance over the next 15 years. The third friction point is geopolitical. India's policy of strategic autonomy gives it flexibility but not immunity. Managing simultaneous border tensions with China, deepening its defense partnership with the United States through the Quad framework, maintaining historical ties with Russia, and building new corridors of influence across the global south requires a level of foreign policy sophistication that will be tested repeatedly. The India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, announced at the G20 summit in New Delhi in September 2023, is the most significant physical connectivity project India has ever engaged with at a global level. Its success would reshape trade routes that have remained fundamentally unchanged since the opening of the Suez Canal. Its failure, if geopolitical friction between its constituent members prevents implementation, would represent a missed strategic inflection point of considerable magnitude. These are not reasons to revise the structural thesis. They are the variables that determine the speed and smoothness of the trajectory, not the direction. Let us now speak to the financial architecture of India's rise, because this is where the macroeconomic dominance story becomes most tangible for global investors, policymakers, and strategic thinkers. India's capital markets have undergone a transformation that deserves dedicated analysis. The Bombay Stock Exchange and the National Stock Exchange together have a combined market capitalization that crossed $4 trillion in 2024, making it the fifth largest equity market in the world by capitalization. Domestic retail investor participation, facilitated by the digitization of brokerage accounts and the systematic investment plan culture built by India's mutual fund industry, now represents a structural stabilizer for Indian equities that reduces, though does not eliminate, vulnerability to foreign institutional capital flight. Over 90 million unique retail investor accounts existed in India's equity markets by 2024. This democratization of capital market participation is not just a financial inclusion metric. It is a macroeconomic stability mechanism that most emerging markets lack entirely. The rupee's internationalization is an emerging story that will define India's financial sovereignty over the next decade. India has signed bilateral trade agreements in national currencies with Russia, the UAE, Malaysia, and several other partners. The Reserve Bank of India has pursued this strategy with deliberate gradualism, avoiding the destabilization risks of premature full convertibility while methodically expanding the rupee's international footprint. This is not a challenge to dollar hegemony in the near term, but it is the construction of the scaffolding for a future in which Indian trade is less exposed to dollar-denominated commodity price volatility and US monetary policy transmission effects. Foreign direct investment into India reached approximately $71 billion in fiscal year 2023, and the composition of that investment is more strategically significant than the headline number. It is no longer concentrated in traditional sectors like information technology services and telecommunications. It is flowing into semiconductors, renewable energy, defense manufacturing, electric vehicles, and pharmaceutical manufacturing. These are strategic sector investments, the kind that signal a fundamental long-term commitment to India as a production and innovation hub, rather than merely a consumer market. Speaking of which, the consumer market story is one that global corporations are only beginning to price in correctly. India will add approximately 140 million households to its consuming middle class by 2030, according to McKinsey Global Institute estimates. These are households crossing the consumption threshold of $10,000 annually in purchasing power parity terms. The scale of this consumption expansion has no contemporary parallel. Not even China's consumption boom of the early 2000s, which was the largest consumer market emergence in history at that point, matched this demographic and economic profile. India's consumer market expansion is happening simultaneously with the rise of digital commerce infrastructure, which means the cost of reaching these consumers is dramatically lower for businesses than it was during China's equivalent phase. The automobile sector alone tells the story with precision. India became the third largest automobile market in the world in 2023, surpassing Japan. The electric vehicle transition within this market is accelerating at a pace that is creating entirely new domestic industrial champions. Tata Motors, through its Nexon EV and the broader portfolio of its electric mobility strategy, has captured domestic market share against global EV giants in ways that would have seemed improbable 5 years ago. The underlying dynamic here is not just patriotic consumer preference. It is a structural cost advantage in the Indian EV ecosystem that combines lower labor costs, rapidly improving battery supply chain domestication, and government policy support through the FAME scheme. This isn't a trend. This is a permanent shift in where global automotive industrial power is concentrated, and it is shifting toward India's domestic champions with a momentum that quarterly earnings calls in Detroit, Munich, and Tokyo are beginning to reflect with increasing urgency. The India-Africa relationship deserves specific examination because it represents the most under-analyzed vector of India's expanding global influence. African nations, collectively representing 1.4 billion people and some of the world's fastest-growing economies, are making sovereign choices about infrastructure partners, technology vendors, educational collaborations, and diplomatic alignments. India's historical connection to the African continent through the Indian diaspora, through the non-aligned movement's legacy, and through South-South solidarity rhetoric has now been operationalized into concrete economic architecture. The India-Africa Forum Summit process has facilitated multi-billion-dollar lines of credit for infrastructure development. Indian pharmaceutical companies supply a majority of Africa's generic medicine requirements. Indian technology companies are building fintech solutions designed specifically for African market conditions. This is comprehensive strategic engagement, and it positions India as the partner of choice across a continent that will add 800 million people to its working-age population by 2050. The China-India comparison is, at this point in the analysis, unavoidable, and it must be made with precision rather than the imprecision that political commentary typically brings to it. China's economic rise was a manufacturing LED, export-driven, state-directed model that functioned with extraordinary efficiency within the specific global conditions of the 1990s and 2000s. A rules-based trade order, US consumer appetite for cheap manufactured goods, massive foreign direct investment inflows, and a domestic political system capable of overriding property rights, environmental concerns, and worker welfare considerations to maximize production speed. That model produced the fastest large-scale poverty reduction in human history. That is a factual statement, and it deserves full acknowledgement. But that model is now structurally exhausted within China. The return on infrastructure investment in China has fallen dramatically. The debt levels accumulated by local government financing vehicles represent systemic risk that China's leadership is managing with increasing difficulty. The demographic reversal is not a forecast. It is already measured in the data. China's working-age population has been declining since approximately 2015, and the pace of that decline accelerates through the 2030s. India's model is different in composition and therefore in durability. It is services-led, domestically consumption-driven, and increasingly diversified across manufacturing, technology, and financial services. It operates within a democratic institutional framework that creates friction and inefficiency in the short term but generates institutional legitimacy that attracts a different and ultimately more sustainable quality of foreign investment. The rule of law, an independent judiciary, a free press, and competitive elections may slow certain executive decisions, but they also prevent the category of catastrophic policy error that autocratic systems are uniquely capable of committing at national scale. This is not an ideological argument. It is a risk-adjusted return argument. And every major institutional investor managing long-horizon capital understands this distinction with clarity. As we approach the synthesis of this analysis, let us speak to the 2030 forecast, because that is the horizon at which India's structural trajectory produces its most consequential geopolitical effects. The IMF's World Economic Outlook currently projects India to become the third largest economy in the world by approximately 2027 to 2028, surpassing Germany. By 2030, on multiple credible forecast trajectories, including those from Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and the Asian Development Bank, India's GDP is projected to approach or exceed $7 trillion. That would make it the second or third largest economy on the planet, depending on the trajectory of the US and Chinese economies during that period. But the number that matters more than the GDP ranking is the share of global growth that India will represent. The IMF has already noted that India accounts for approximately 15 to 18% of global GDP growth annually. This is the number that makes India not just a large economy, but an indispensable economy. When India grows at 6.5 to 7% annually, it generates more incremental economic output than any other nation on Earth. This is macroeconomic dominance of a specific and powerful variety. It is the dominance of being the engine that the global system cannot afford to lose. The semiconductor story is the final structural layer that needs examination before we close this briefing. India's ambition to build a domestic semiconductor ecosystem, anchored by the India Semiconductor Mission and by the Tata Group's commitment to build India's first domestic fabrication plant in partnership with PSMC of Taiwan, represents the most consequential industrial policy decision of the decade. Semiconductors are the strategic commodity of the 21st century. They are what oil was to the 20th century, the resource whose control determines who dictates terms in the global industrial order. India's semiconductor play is not a short-term bet. Fab construction timelines operate on 5 to 7-year horizons, but the geopolitical logic is overwhelming. A world in which India produces strategically significant quantities of its own semiconductors is a world in which India can negotiate its technology partnerships from a position of genuine strategic parity. And the United States, which has explicitly identified India as the preferred alternative production base for critical semiconductors outside its own borders, is actively facilitating this outcome through bilateral technology agreements and the strategic alignment embedded in the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technology, the ICET framework. India dictates the terms of its own technology future, and that future is being constructed now. So where does this leave us? It leaves us at a moment of extraordinary strategic clarity for anyone willing to look at the data without the ideological filters that most legacy institutions apply. India's rise from the 11th to the 4th largest economy in a single decade is not a headline. It is not a political talking point. It is the leading edge of a structural realignment of global power that will define the first half of the 21st century. Every assumption about who leads the technology revolution, who anchors global trade corridors, who sets the terms of development finance, and who builds the operating systems of the next digital economy, is being systematically revised in real time. And the revision points toward New Delhi. The investors who understood this in 2014 did not simply make good returns. They positioned themselves on the right side of history's most significant economic transformation in progress. The institutional analysts who dismissed India in 2014 are now scrambling to update their models and explain their misses to their clients. The difference between those two groups was not intelligence. It was the willingness to follow the structural data to its logical conclusion rather than stopping at the comfortable boundary of consensus thinking. Here is the strategic question I want to leave you with today. Not as a rhetorical flourish, but as a genuine analytical challenge that deserves serious personal reflection. As the global economy reorganizes itself around India's growing gravitational pull, as supply chains reroute, as capital reallocates, as diplomatic alignments shift, and as the institutions of the post-1945 global order adapt or become obsolete, what is your strategic position? Are you building knowledge of this shift in advance of the mainstream acknowledgement? Are you developing frameworks that help you understand where the next phase of this transformation leads? Are your professional, financial, and intellectual decisions being made with an accurate map of the world as it is becoming, rather than the world as it was? Because the shift is not coming, the shift is underway, and the data is not ambiguous. Stay sharp, stay strategic. The world is being rebuilt in real time, and you now have the intelligence to read it.